COVID restrictions to stop the spread of the Omicron variant means it's going to be harder for holidaymakers hoping to get away. Unvaccinated Brits are no longer allowed into Spain, and those hoping to get to Switzerland must isolate for 10 days on arrival, even after showing a negative test result.
And Japan is the third country after Israel and Morocco to announce they're closing borders to all foreign visitors. So, should the UK follow suit? Joining us now, Amitava Banerjee is Professor of Clinical Data Science and a consultant cardiologist at University College London, and thinks, let's act fast and close the borders. Paul Charles, though, is Chief Executive of the travel consultancy, the PC agency, who says that that's extreme and won't work. Well, welcome to you both. Professor Banerjee, does it work if we close our borders?
Good morning, Susanna, good morning. So I would like to stress that border control is part of what we need to be doing, and it's at best buying us time to take stock of how transmissible, how virulent this new virus is as more information comes in. And we know from previous waves that acting early is when border control works. So that's why I'm advocating that we should do it sooner rather than later.
Is
but it's
it
not.
The trouble is, of course, we know that already 3 identified cases of Omicron in the UK. I can imagine it's very likely, isn't it, that it is broader than that. We just haven't perhaps been testing for this particular variant. Do you think it's more likely that it's wider spread already?
I think it is likely that it is wider spread. And that's why I was saying that inside the country as well, we need to be trying to reduce the spread and reduce the infection rate. We have had, as you know, a regularly high case rate throughout the last few months. And now we've seen that mask wearing in public, but also we need to see that in closed spaces and reduce the transmission so that we don't have more cases or we minimise the number.
Paul, let's come to you because, Paul, I think the vast majority of our viewers that have got in touch with us already this morning are all in agreement with Professor Banerjee that we should be closing our borders, we should be restricting who is coming into the UK as soon as possible. Let's do it now, and hopefully Christmas can be as normal as possible. How much of a concern is this to you and the travel industry that, you know, just as you're starting to get back on your feet with everything that's happened over the last 2 years, suddenly the government are bringing in more controls?
Well, Christmas can't be normal if you're stopping family coming in to see you. So let's move away from that for starters. Border control is one thing, but there are different types of border control. And we've seen in Australia and New Zealand, for example, that when you close borders, you don't stop infections coming in. And we haven't stopped infections coming into this country. What you should be doing instead, as a government, is essentially saying we're going to bring back pre-departure testing. That would weed out most infections coming into the UK, inbound. But by actually putting people into quarantine, both in hotels and at home, all we're saying, in fact, is that Britain is closed for business. We're closed to people coming in for leisure ahead of Christmas. And we're causing enormous financial and mental distress to people.
Labour are calling for pre-departure tests, for PCR tests. And obviously, and I've travelled in the last few months with my children and my family, and you have to take a PCR test to get into the country, depending on where you're going. Have the government explained why they haven't insisted that there has to be a pre-departure test for PCR test to come into the UK, and why they don't think that's necessary?
Well, I think they've fallen back on what they regard as tried and tested methods, which is just shutting borders as easily or as quickly as possible. You do have to praise them for moving fast and not dithering. That is something government has learned. But we're back now into the world of high-cost testing, little regulation over test providers, enormous distress for people who've got plans over Christmas. And what the government's done is effectively create 3 weeks of limbo for consumers, because we're not going to know for 3 weeks until these rules are reviewed whether, in fact, our Christmas plans are going to be able to go ahead. And we're shutting down the economy, the travel economy, at the same time, just at the moment when it was beginning to recover. So it's going to cause enormous uncertainty for consumers interested in booking in future, but also, of course, causing enormous distress for travel companies over the weekend.
Professor Banerjee, the World Health Organization has just announced the likelihood of potential further spread of Omicron at the global level is high. That's just been released in a technical brief. It may be high. We're not yet sure, are we, how serious this variant is. Might be, it might be spreading, but we heard earlier from a doctor in South Africa that at the moment it seems it could be mild. Are you concerned that may change?
Thanks, Susanna. As I said, there are three aspects that we should all be interested in. One is how infectious or how transmissible this is, which the accounts that we've had seem to show that it is transmissible. We don't know how virulent or how severe an illness it causes, and it would be, of course, great if it is milder. And finally, if the existing vaccines that we have are protective against it in the way that they have been against previous strains of the virus. And so that is still all emerging. And so while we find all of that out, which may take some days, we should be acting early. That's what I'm saying.
Professor, Andy makes a good point on Twitter. He says, look, there's always going to be new variants. We've seen so many new variants as well coming in. If we do this every time there's a new variant, we're never going to get back to normal. And as I know that we're all sort of waiting to see just how serious, whether it's going to be mild or not, there is a reality there, isn't there, for Paul's industry, that they are constantly being held in limbo. They are being moved forward and backwards as we panic. But these variants and these mutations are going to keep coming, aren't they?
Sadly, there are likely to be more variants, but we need to have a robust response when they do come, because every industry, I'm extremely sympathetic and empathetic to whether it's the travel industry or other industries. And in fact, as well, in my own industry in hospitals, the non-COVID care has been affected by COVID for nearly 2 years now. And so we want to stay on top of this, but we have to follow what's happening internationally, nationally, and find out more and reduce the spread, because in the long run that will reduce the time of disruption. That's what we've seen, and that will eventually get us back to normal quicker.
Paul, let's just address some of the countries which have changed rules on whether you can go or not. And if you're, for instance, planning a skiing trip to Switzerland, all people travelling from the UK must present a negative COVID-19 test and quarantine for 10 days. Now, that's going to scupper skiing trips, isn't it, that people might have had planned at Christmas or New Year. Spain has closed its borders to all unvaccinated British tourists, excluding children under 12. Brits will have to carry proof of both vaccines. That comes in from Wednesday. What do people do if they've got trips coming up and suddenly these changes are made?
Well, the first thing is to leave it until the last minute if you can, because, of course, we've seen that things change so quickly. So best advice, especially if you've got bookings over Christmas and New Year, is to hold fire at the moment, because hopefully this will be a false alarm and restrictions will unravel. But I fear that we're going to see more restrictions introduced in the coming days. You're seeing a tightening around the world. You've got issues such as with Switzerland, for example, differing advice over whether the rules apply to those who are transiting through Geneva into France for their holidays. And that's not been cleared up yet by the Swiss government. So the rules are causing confusion and concern and a drop in confidence. And that's the problem. Existing bookings are in limbo. Future bookings, people are worried about making at the moment because they're not sure whether the rules will get worse. And this is all because of maybes and possibles and ifs and buts. And hopefully this variant will not cause the issues that some are fearing.
Well, the World Health Organization has added to that announcement that Susanna mentioned earlier. They've just said Omicron has an unprecedented number of spike mutations, some of which are concerning for their potential impact on the trajectory of the pandemic. And as you say, it's ifs and buts and maybes at the moment, but they need the next couple of weeks to try and work out exactly how serious this is going to be, don't they?
Thank you to both of our guests.